Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about the differences between closed and open kinetic chain movements. I'm often asked, what are the differences, not just definition-wise, because that's pretty basic, pretty simple, but more importantly, what are the functional differences, especially when I'm training somebody? Why would I not use, say, open kinetic chain exercises, or why would I not use closed chain exercises? And that's a pretty important piece of information to know, especially when you're just working with the average person. And I will say that the key difference, at least for a personal trainer, remember, we're not talking about clinicians who do need to know quite a bit more about this from a biomechanical perspective when you're dealing with injuries, osteo type of injuries, musculoskeletal type injuries. It's critical that you know the difference, obviously, because there are different levels and different types of forces at the joints that are being worked over. So before I get into that, please go ahead, make sure that you subscribe. Click the like button if this is a helpful video. Anytime you go into our videos, please let us know that you understood the video, you liked it, it was helpful, by leaving a comment, and for sure hitting that like button as well. Okay, so back to the difference. What is just academically on paper, what's the difference between open and closed kinetic chain? Now remember, kinetic chain simply means the sum total of all the joints and limbs that are involved in particular movements. So again, from personal training perspective, we talk about lateral raises, bench presses, dumbbell curls. These are your common core type of exercises, routine exercises that are being used. And for the most part, very simple, straightforward ways to do these exercises, right? So if I'm doing a dumbbell curl, it's the elbow joint, right? But the kinetic chain actually is defined in a dumbbell curl, for instance, as the shoulder joint being the initiating proximal component of the kinetic chain. Why? Because the bicep, which is what you're working over, which is what's working, actually has one head that crosses over the shoulder joint. So technically, the shoulder joint is involved in a dumbbell curl, even though it is a stabilizing component. So it doesn't matter if the joint is going through concentric, eccentric movements, as long as a joint in that exercise provides some sort of direct stabilization, we would include it in the kinetic chain. So again, trying to stay as focused as I can here with personal training, meaning common core type of training exercises like the dumbbell curl, lateral raise, bench press. Okay. So we have what's known as a proximal component to the kinetic chain and a distal component to the kinetic chain. Again, if you're writing it on paper, you can, express open and closed as either the distal or the proximal component of the kinetic chain moving or stabilized. Okay. So again, the kinetic chain, summation of all the joints and limbs involved in a particular movement. If I do lateral raises, again, technically you would say that the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist and the joints and fingers are all part of that kinetic chain, which is correct. Depending on who you talk to, whether they are a clinician or not, they might include the scapulothoracic joints as well, meaning the scapula on the rib cage and the shoulder girdle. So I got no problem including that as well. But again, for simplicity purposes, we generally just say it's the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, and the joints of the fingers if you want to throw them in there. So that, again, that would be a kinetic chain, right? And it's all the joints, right, and limbs that are involved in sequentially along the pattern of movement that you're working with. Name an exercise and tell me the joint that's moving or joints that are moving, and then kind of look up one joint or down to those joints that then act as stabilizers, and you're generally pretty close to all of those components that are part of that quote kinetic chain. So leg extensions, leg curls, squats. Think about it for a second. Any of those exercises, what are the joints that are actually moving, even if it's just slightly, little bit? And then what are the joints above those movement joints and the ones below, for instance, that are acting as primary direct stabilizers, so to speak. And you're getting real close to what would be considered the kinetic chain for that movement. So what's the difference between open and closed is simply what part of the kinetic chain, either the proximal part of the kinetic chain, meaning that area of the kinetic chain that's closest to your spinal column, midline of your body. Technically, we say midline of the body, so spinal column, pelvis, or which part is furthest away, what we call the distal. I like to think of that as distance. So always remember distal and proximal by thinking distance, meaning distance further away. So that part of the kinetic chain that is furthest away from the midline of the body. So proximal, close to your spinal column, midpoint of your body, distal being that part of the kinetic chain that's furthest. Now, real quick, before I give you the difference, the best way to kind of think about this from a personal training perspective when it comes to exercise performance is the kinetic chain, 99% of the time, involves the hands and the feet, right? When we do any type of upper body movement, we generally move the hands, right? Or we do something with the feet, right? And that's an easy way to remember that you're probably dealing with distal components of the kinetic chain being the hands or the feet, right? Because they're generally going to be the furthest parts of the chain, kinetic chain, from the midline of the body. So remember what I talked about, lateral raises, dumbbell curls. If I'm doing a dumbbell curl, what part of this sequence of joints, limbs, joint, limb, joint, what part of that sequence or that chain of components is furthest from my body, the midline of my body? Well, it's the hands. So in general, it's just easy to remember that more than likely, whatever exercise you're doing, the hands or the feet are going to be the distal component of the chain. And then all of the joints subsequently up closest to the shoulder, thoracic area, or up towards the pelvis and hips are going to be the proximal component. So I hope that makes sense. The difference between an open and closed is simply which one of those components of the chain is actually moving in time and space and which one is stable. Open kinetic chain, simply just from a purely definitional standpoint, an open kinetic chain is when the distal aspect or distal component of the chain, like your hands during a dumbbell curl, your hands during a lateral raise, your hands during a dumbbell press, the distal aspect of the chain is in motion, is moving in time and space, right? And the proximal is stationary. So I'm sitting down, my shoulders are stationary, right? They actually may be moving joint wise, but it's the distal component, this part that's literally going from here to here, 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 here. So it's moving in time and space. Distal moves in time and space. This part is stationary. This component is stationary. And that's what we call an open kinetic chain. Name the exercise where the hands are moving, and it's an open chain exercise. Closed is just the opposite. That distal component is not moving, and generally the body is moving in relation to a fixed distal distal aspect of the chain. Hence, we have push-ups, right? With push-ups, where are your hands? They're on the ground, and the body is moving, versus a bench press where the body is stable, proximal, and the hands are moving, distal's moving. Okay, so open, distal moves, proximal fixed, closed, distal is fixed, proximal is moving. Okay, think of your standard exercises. Squats, for instance, are a closed kinetic chain movement. Why? Because the feet, which is the distal aspect of the kinetic chain during a squat, the feet are stationary on the ground. They're not moving, and you're not, I hope you're not doing that. They're on the ground, and the rest of the body is moving up and down. Closed kinetic chain, push-ups, pull-ups, squats, hack squats, right? Those are some of your standard exercises. You don't have to memorize 50 different exercises, folks. So that's the difference between open and closed. But the real question is what then is the difference, and why would you maybe, not always, but maybe choose closed over open? And the answer to that in general, now there may be some other reasons, but here is my main reason for saying I better do a closed chain movement versus an open. It always comes down to what we call injury prevention or workarounds. Get it? I can do workarounds. Like when I do a lateral raise, I can do a workaround. If my client feels some tension up in their trapezius while they're doing a lateral raise, I can do a workaround. What is a workaround? It's a way to change the biomechanics of the movement by changing some position in the kinetic chain. Okay, that's a workaround. So in other words, I can bring my hands further to the front, move them further back. I can bend the elbow more when I do a lateral raise. You do this probably anyway, automatically, right? If you don't feel it in the target muscle, you got to do a workaround. If it hurts in one area, you got to do a workaround. Yeah, don't do an exercise that hurts and has some discomfort to it. Change the biomechanics of the movement. That's the whole point of exercise performance, especially with a trainer, is that they can isolate and discern, does that hurt you in your neck? Because I'm not training my traps when I do lateral raises. I'm training my deltoids. Do you feel it in the deltoids? If I'm doing a dumbbell curl and I'm feeling it in my forearms, not my bicep, something is amiss biomechanically. So you've got to change some component or position of the kinetic chain. Now, that workaround generally works, 99.9% of the time as far as I've dealt with, just like a dumbbell curl. If I'm not feeling it in my bicep or it hurts my elbow, what is the classic workaround for a dumbbell curl, standard dumbbell curls? Well, just change the biomechanics by changing the position of the wrist from supinated to neutral, right? Or a little bit, whatever the case is. But this change in the shifting of the mechanical position of the ulnar and the radius by going more medial and neutralizing the grip, most of the time will take the pain away from the elbow. So that's one. Now the question becomes, what if that doesn't work and you're messing around and you can't figure out the best way to do an exercise to take away the pain, discomfort, or they're not feeling it? Well, this is where knowing the closed, open kinetic chain differences can really help. In other words, I've trained folks who, for whatever reason, when they do dumbbell presses or they do bench presses, it hurts their shoulders. I'll mess around. I'll do everything I can to get them to feel it in their pecs. For some reason, they can't. And it may be that they just don't have the stable, whatever the case is, there are times when I will have to say, as an open kinetic chain movement, perhaps there's a better way to do this. And I will generally shift into a closed chain movement. And in this case, when you're talking about your pecs, your delts and your triceps, it's going to be what? Push-ups, right? Because push-ups is the standard. It's the classic closed kinetic chain movement that you'd be using on your upper body. Fact of the matter is that the difference with a bench press, which potentially can allow me to isolate the muscle more, open chain movements generally allow that because you're generally not always working over a single joint or two joints. But in a push-up, it's not really possible to do that, but it just may be. And it's worked any number of times when I've tried it, that when I shift over from an open kinetic chain movement to a closed kinetic chain movement on the same muscle, because the forces at the joint are different, they may actually feel it more. I want you to give that a try. Another great example is doing pulley rows for your back, right? So open kinetic chain movement, pulley rows. And anyway, however you're doing them. And the client just isn't feeling it either in their lats or they feel it too much in their lower back. I'm just giving you a for instance. Any number of ways to kind of modify the biomechanics of that open chain movement, but there may be a point where you go, it isn't working. What do you do? Now, the whole point of this video is consider shifting into a closed chain movement that works the same muscle. And what is going to be the standard closed chain exercise that trains the lats, the traps, the biceps, things like that? Exactly. Pull-ups, right? Chin-ups. Perhaps that would be a way, depending on the person, whether or not they can actually pull themselves up. But you can always give them assistance so they can do the movement. And you've now changed, or at least you've given this type of workaround a chance. So again, the goal here is not to just say do pull-ups instead of pull downs or bent over rows, whatever the case is, but to think about and consider that when you are doing workarounds, and that's the whole point of this, is that if when you're doing workarounds with, for instance, open chain movements, and you're still not getting the results you want when it comes to feeling the target muscle or pain or discomfort in that particular exercise in a particular muscle group, think about and consider a closed chain alternative. Again, not all closed chain alternatives, like pull-ups, for instance, are going to be suitable for every client, because not every client in that case can literally lift themselves up and do one. So you might have to give them a little assistance, but it's something to consider and think about when you're doing and planning your program design. And then you have to do a workaround to potentially deal with an issue that you're dealing with, in this case, say, an open chain movement. The whole point here is that I want to give you some options to consider based on something other than just range of motion biomechanics during that exercise. You can actually sequence out and go into in this case, say open, try a closed chain exercise and see if that works. I hope that this video was helpful. And if it was, like I said earlier, put the word understand in there. And if you got a question even further on this topic, let us know. Remember to click the link in the description box if you want to become a certified, qualified personal trainer. We look forward to seeing you. Remember, seeing you in the Facebook group as well. But remember, every Wednesday night, we do an exam study, live exam study using Quizlet. A lot of fun, 30 minutes, 6 p.m. Eastern. You would find a link somewhere in the Facebook group or in the video description as well. And then come on board Wednesday night, 6 to 6:30 p.m. and that's Eastern Standard Time. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.